The Holy Gospel according to Luke. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus said, "But I say to you who are listening, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who asks of you. And if anyone takes away what is yours, do not ask for it back again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you expect to receive payment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. Instead, love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return, for your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For he himself is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given back to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Probably no admonition of Jesus has been more difficult to follow than the command to love your enemies. Some people have sincerely felt that its actual practice is not possible. It is easy, they say, to love those who love you, but how can one love those who openly and insidiously seek to defeat you? Others contend that Jesus' exhortation to love one's enemies is testimony to the fact that the Christian ethic is designed for the weak and cowardly and not for the strong and courageous. Jesus, they say, was an impractical idealist. If anyone had cause to succumb to bitter hatred for their enemies, it would be Martin Luther King Jr., who wrote these opening words of his sermon, appropriately titled "Loving Your Enemies," while he was in jail in Georgia, and who endured constant threats, violence, and vitriol throughout his life and ministry. And yet, in an eloquent and challenging sermon, King doubles down. In spite of these insistent questions and persistent objections, this command of Jesus challenges us with new urgency, he says. Upheaval after upheaval has reminded us that humanity is traveling along a road called hate, in a journey that will bring us to destruction and damnation. Far from being the pious injunction of a utopian dreamer, the command to love one's enemy is an absolute necessity for our survival. Love, even for enemies, is the key to the solution of the problems of our world. Jesus is not an impractical idealist. He is the practical realist. So when Jesus said, "Love your enemy," he was not unmindful of its stringent qualities, yet he meant every word of it. Our responsibility as Christians is to discover the meaning of this command and seek passionately to live it out in our daily lives. If anyone had cause to succumb to bitter hatred for their enemies, it's Joseph, whose story we hear only in parts at its climactic and emotionally charged conclusion in today's first reading. Joseph, who at only 17 years of age becomes the victim of sibling rivalry run amok, when his brothers, consumed by jealousy and rage, throw their brother Joseph, his father's favorites, into a pit, leaving him for dead. Joseph, who instead of actually being left for dead, is sold into slavery for 20 pieces of silver, and whose death is intricately faked by his brothers, who proceed to take his robe, tear it, slaughter a goat, and dip his robe in the goat's blood to show to their grieving father. Joseph, who initially finds favor in Egypt in the house of Potiphar, an Egyptian official, but who ends up being tricked by Potiphar's wife, framed for assault, and thrown into prison. Joseph, whose knack for interpreting dreams finally pays off when he is able to interpret none other than Pharaoh's dreams, predicting 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine in Egypt, and who now, 30 years old, is set up by Pharaoh as his second in command, to be the overseer of a large-scale endeavor to take advantage of these 7 years of plenty in order to ensure Egypt's survival and even prosperity in the 7 years of famine to come. Joseph, now in a position of great privilege and immense political power, when the famine sets in 7 years later and word of Egypt's prosperity spreads even to Canaan, when his brothers come to Egypt to bring back food for their family, and when Joseph finally has his opportunity for retribution and to use his position of privilege and power to exact revenge. Joseph, who knows exactly who they are, even though they don't recognize him, who has had 22 long years to think and stew, and who organizes an intricate plan of his own to reunite all of his brothers, even Benjamin, his father's second favorite, who initially stayed behind for good reason. Joseph, who now has all of his brothers at his mercy, shows mercy. How do we love our enemies? Again from King. First, we must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. A forgiveness, to be clear, which can only come from the injured party. A forgiveness which doesn't erase the harm or the injustice done from memory, but insists that the thing done no longer remains a barrier to relationship. Joseph, so moved to the brink of emotional collapse, and whose weeping is so loud that the entire household of Pharaoh can hear it, finally reveals himself to his brothers in what can only be described as an act of mercy, an act of forgiveness, an act of love, and ultimately an act of reconciliation as the entire family, their father included, reunites and settles in Egypt. Well, that's a nice Bible story, isn't it? That's all well and good for Joseph and his brothers, but we live in the not-so-nice here and now. Is this story and Jesus' imperative to love your enemies really meant for us? How are we supposed to love our enemies under an administration that seeks to tear families of immigrants apart and that threatens to erase the existence of our transgender siblings? How are we supposed to love our enemies in a political climate that fosters mistrust of those who are different and hatred of the other? I admit that right now, this loving our enemies thing is hard. But maybe therein lies the key. Loving our enemies. We should be happy, King writes, that Jesus did not say, like your enemies. It is almost impossible to like some people. Like is a sentimental and affectionate word. How can we be affectionate toward a person whose avowed aim is to crush our very being and place innumerable stumbling blocks in our path? How can we like a person who is threatening our children and bombing our homes? That is impossible. But Jesus recognized that love is greater than like. This is not eros, a kind of romantic love, nor is it philia, a reciprocal affection between friends or acquaintances. This is agape, the love of God operating in the human heart. We don't have to like our enemies to love them. We don't even have to love our enemies to love them like that. We love our enemies because God first loved us and loves us deeply. We love our enemies because God is love, because this love is from God and for all people, without restriction and beyond our comprehension. To be perfectly clear, this does not mean making peace or being complicit with evil. Nor does it mean abandoning our baptismal calling to strive for justice and peace in all the earth. Loving our enemies does not mean ignoring the harm or the injustice that they cause. Loving our enemies means not letting those things have the final word. Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, King contends. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Time is cluttered with the wreckage of communities that surrendered to hate and violence. For the salvation of our nation and the salvation of humankind, we must follow another way. Love your enemies. It is admittedly one of Jesus' most difficult teachings, one which he himself surely struggled with, as his own message took him to the ridicule of the cross, which puts us with Joseph and Martin Luther King Jr. in good company. And yet Jesus knew exactly what he was saying and meant every word of it. Love your enemies. Love, because hatred gets us nowhere worth going. Love, because it has the power to save us.